Hello, and welcome to our session of Framework for Applying Equity-Minded and Equity-Centered Assessment Practices. I'm Ann Lundquist, and my colleague Gavin Henning is here. We'll introduce ourselves first before we get started. So I'm a white, cis, straight woman and a grandmother, a yogi, a poet, and a Buddhist. A little bit about my identities. I also come from some pretty privileged backgrounds in terms of being third generation educated and also being white. And Gavin and I both like to talk about those identities as a part of this work, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the session. Currently, I serve as the interim director for the Hope Center for College Community and Justice at Temple University. And we work with student basic needs work through research and policy and practice. Gavin?
Yeah, I'm Gavin Henning. I use he, him, his pronouns, professor of higher education at New England College in New Hampshire. I direct our Master of Science in Higher Education Administration, as well as our Doctor of Education programs. And my social identities include white, heterosexual, cisgender man, lots of privilege in all those identities. And I have some relational identities as well, which include husband, son, uncle, a lot of other ones as well. And when Ann and I talk about both the social identities and relational identities, we bring that up because it does relate to all of this kind of work. So I'll pass it back over to Ann to provide an overview and context.
Great, thank you. So we're really excited to talk with you today about this. Gavin and I have been working together for 3, 4, 5 years now, thinking about this topic and talking with so many other people in the field. But we also want to just start with having you reflect for a minute on what you think of when you hear these terms equity-minded or equity-centered assessment. We know we're not there with you in person, but just maybe as we get started and just to frame your own thinking, this may be familiar to you, this may be new concepts to you, but just a little bit about what you think about when you hear these terms. And then we want to define a couple of terms here. Again, this is pretty standard for most people that are probably in this session, but we really want to make sure that we're clear about the fact that diversity is really the fact or quality of being different. So, you know, it's a fact. Inclusion has to do with including people from all groups. And so it's an action that can be taken. And then equity, which is what we're going to be talking about here, is really about fairness and justice for all. So it's an intention for that fairness and justice. And social justice is really to act to foster a just society with fair and equitable treatment. So it's that intention plus many different kinds of actions. So we're going to be using the word equity and social justice a lot in the rest of this time together. So one of the things that we like to start off with is by giving a little bit of context here about the fact that the field of assessment, which Gavin and I both come from in terms of our own backgrounds and teaching and work, has been very separated both in the scholarship and also on campus, you know, in practical terms from diversity, equity, and inclusion work. So the people may be colleagues with one another, but in practical terms, they're usually situated in different places in an institution. The scholarship is very different. And so these worlds have not really come together very distinctly until probably a couple of years ago, although Gavin's going to trace some earlier scholarship that shows that there's threads of this that go back further. But in terms of like conferences and articles and just being in the tip of our tongues, this assessment DEI work is really sort of coming together very recently. I would mention here that Gavin and I were both part of a survey, we called it the Equity-Centered Landscape Survey, which we partnered with several organizations, NILOA, AACNU, Assessment Institute, ACPA, NASPA, several other organizations. And we wanted to find out about how much these worlds have been coming together and how people are thinking about equity-centered assessment. And we did find in that survey, and the results will be out from that soon in a couple of different arenas, that this intersection is becoming increasingly important, whether people work in student affairs, academic affairs, or lead assessment at their institution. So these worlds are really coming together in very concrete ways. We wanted to give this framework here also to set context before we get a little more specific about the framework that we are here to talk with you about today, that we've sort of come out of our thinking and dialogue with many other people. So most of you who do work in assessment are very familiar with this basic assessment cycle. It may have 6 elements or different elements, but really thinking about the various ways that we approach the methodology and the way we analyze data and how we use and share results, think about our outcomes, and we're very familiar with that. When we talk about equity-centered assessment, we're saying that assessment cycle should take place within this larger context, the societal context and culture in which we live, the institutional context, which might differ from one institution to another, and also like the positionality of the assessor themselves. And that as people begin to consider the assessment cycle in that larger context, this then can have an impact not only on institutional effectiveness, which is and student learning, which is really where assessment is often driven in higher ed, but also on societal culture more broadly.
We're not going to talk a little bit about why we should be thinking about integrating equity into assessment. So first, let's take a look at some 6-year graduation rates. So this comes from the National Center of Education Statistics in 2019. And as you can see, there's some disparate outcomes, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. To be honest, I wasn't aware of how disparate some of these outcomes were, with 10 percentage point difference between Asian American and white, and then between white and Hispanic, and less than 40% American Indian and Alaska Native graduating in 6 years from institutions. So this certainly is something we want to pay attention to. Retention, persistence, completion is a hot topic at every institution, particularly those that where there might be a little bit less resource, because that relates to finances. But I think even more importantly, those of us who work in higher education want to see students succeed. But there are longer term impacts as well. So another study by the National Center of Education Statistics that was just released last year demonstrates a median annual salary or income for folks with high school degree compared to those with bachelor's degree. And there's a $20,700 difference between those two. So imagine what this looks like over 10 years. That's $200,000. Over a 40-year career, that's close to $1 million. And just imagine if just some of that was invested over that period of time. Then that difference even grows exponentially. So there are huge impacts. And we also know that generational wealth happens when people have higher degrees, and they can actually earn more money. So there's really a lot of things to be thinking about. So not just these individual impact in terms of wealth and wealth over time, but even generational wealth. But also another study by Ma and colleagues demonstrate that folks who have a bachelor's degree are more likely to hold a job. They're more likely to be healthy, more likely to vote. They're less likely to be on public assistance. And because they're making more money, they pay more taxes. So there's a benefit societally for this as well. So these are just some of the reasons we should be thinking about equity. But there's this intersection of equity and assessment. We'll talk further about how you can put those together and really leverage assessment for equity. But we want to provide a little bit of the scholarship, because even though I think this topic really became popular in 2017 after the Montenegro and Jankowski culturally responsive assessment occasional paper from NOAA, this work has really been going on for almost a century. Some of the earliest work around responsive evaluation started in 1935 with Reed Jackson evaluating differences in segregated schools in the South. And there's a different topics and nuanced topics as this work has gone through time. So culturally competent evaluation arose in the mid 80s, but also in the early 2000s. Feminist assessment arose in the 90s. There was inclusive assessment in the late 1990s, multicultural evaluation, culture responsive evaluation, decolonizing assessment starting back in 2010, bias-free assessment, critical assessment, socially just assessment, mindful assessment, culturally responsive assessment. And so you can see the similar terms, but they're all nuanced a little bit differently. Culturally relevant assessment, anti-racist assessment, and even some emerging topics around health-centered assessment, and then equity-centered assessment, which we'll focus on a little bit here. But I'm going to have Ann talk a little bit about the difference between equity-minded assessment and equity-centered assessment.
Thanks. So I think this terminology is one of the things that Gavin and I have talked about a lot with ourselves and with colleagues. And Ben Simone at USC Center for Urban Education uses this term equity-minded. So being equity-minded is really a lens. It's an approach. It's the way that we view things. And when we talk about equity-minded assessment, we're almost always thinking about the fact that the goal for the assessment itself is to be equitable. So how it's done, the choices that we make from a methodology point of view, how we approach it throughout the assessment cycle, that we have this equity-minded lens on all the time. When we talk about equity-centered, that really becomes the focus of the assessment itself. So the goal then is to use assessment to actually further equity. So the topics that we choose, again, some of the approaches that are utilized, and then the use of the outcomes to actually dismantle structural inequities. That's really the goal of the assessments itself, is to further equity. So this leads us now to this framework that Gavin and I have been playing around with. When we first sort of rolled this out, if you will, a couple of years ago, we had it in a linear fashion. And the more we talked about it, the more we thought that it isn't actually like a progression of one thing to the next, that you accomplish one piece on the list and then you move on to the next. The landscape survey that I talked about is bearing that out. People use these terms in various times, in various ways. But we'll sort of unpack this a little bit here. Situated outside of our framework, we're thinking that when people aren't being equity-minded or equity-centered, by default, they're often causing harm through the assessment itself. So with unexamined approaches, we can cause harm even without recognizing that. And then in the center of our framework, we put cultivating awareness. And we put this here because we recognize that any attempt to advance equity starts with the self. So assessors start by engaging in their own awareness and their learning and their reflection around their identity and their privilege and their power and their agency, exploring their biases and their cultural assumptions, taking responsibility for their intention and their impact, and having collaborative approaches and inclusive and relational approaches. So this whole idea of cultivating awareness is situated at the center for all of these approaches. And then encircling the framework are two ways of thinking about assessment practices that we were just talking about. So equity-mindedness, really thinking about the social and historical context. And we've got three types of assessment that come here. One is bias-free, where really the approach here is to just eliminate bias to the extent that we can in the assessment. So really thinking about the language that's being used or the approaches that we're taking and eliminating where and how the assessment is administered, eliminating bias. Moving forward then is culturally responsive assessment. This is really, as Gavin mentioned, comes about in Montenegro and Jankowski's culturally responsive assessment white paper. So really thinking about the culture and the context in which the assessment is happening. And then a socially just assessment built on a critical paradigm that really thinks about agency and power and voice, among other elements. And we're really thinking about power and at each step of that assessment process. And then we move to the equity-centered approaches. And these really build on this awareness and harm reduction and equity-minded approaches, and really focus more intentionally on systems and not just on individuals. So here, when we talk about deconstructed assessment, this not only considers systems of power and oppression, but intentionally moves to expose social structures that contribute to power and oppression. And then anti-racist assessment builds on deconstructed assessment more specifically. So thinking about how programs and services and policies and practices are racist in nature, and they're built upon white supremacist assumptions and bias. And so acknowledging that and deconstructing and exposing those as throughout the assessment process. Decolonizing assessment is really, while thinking that takes a step of further to critically analyze this, not only through a Western lens, but to really think through a non-Western lens, and how higher education itself is based on European ideals and a Western canon and Western beliefs and just what constitutes knowledge and learning, all of that. So taking all of that into consideration and thinking how we can decolonize and think about student learning in particular in that context as well. And then assessment for social justice is really the aggregate of these previous levels. So not only does it seek to address bias and be culturally responsive and work to expose and seek to understand the impact of societal structures on power and oppression, but really using assessment to advance social justice itself. And so really remedy the inequities in higher education within specific institutional contexts. So this is sort of our thinking around these things. It's constantly evolving. And we do have a blog that we've written where we spend some more time on each aspect of that framework. But we're curious, as you hear about those things, how you might be thinking about using a framework such as this, where you might think about applying such a framework, and where any of the pieces of the framework might resonate with the work that you're doing. So then what we'd like to talk about a little bit here is just some considerations for implementation. So I mentioned that landscape survey earlier. And in there, we did find that a lot of people were using the terminology in various ways that we mentioned throughout the framework, culturally responsive, socially just, not in consistent ways with one another. So that's one of the things, is that people might adopt terminology on their own campus or in their own context, and it might vary campus to campus. But we are trying to think about how this turns into practice. So some of the considerations for implementation or for using a framework like this is thinking about our own identities and how they impact how we teach and how we assess. A framework like this can help us think about how higher education itself, and therefore how our very teaching, is colonized and privileges Western ways of knowing and paradigms, and where that's happening and to what extent that's happening. So concepts like validity is one good example, or just what constitutes knowledge or demonstration of learning. How good teaching requires assessment, and also the alignment of program outcomes, course learning activities, course assignments, grading, course assessments, how those all map. So thinking of using a framework like this to think about how those might map to one another. Also, another thing that we think is important is to think about how we might pause to consider our teaching and assessment methods. There is this concept of an equity pause. So thinking about who they include and who they exclude. Also thinking about assignments we choose to use and how we grade those. So how much of an assignment, for example, measures the required learning versus how to navigate the assignment method itself. And how the assignment method can affect the demonstration of learning. So unpacking all of that while we're also thinking about assessment.
So we'll kind of deconstruct some of those and talk about some specific strategies. And as Ann mentioned, I don't think we can really think about good teaching without thinking about assessment. So some of these strategies you may think, oh, those are teaching strategies, but we think they're clearly connected to assessment because of some of that alignment Ann talked about. First of all, we suggest using universal design for learning principles. So think about how to motivate students, because students are motivated different ways, and that impacts their learning and thus impacts how they learn and then how they demonstrate their learning. Think about sharing content multiple ways. So in a course I teach on research methods, we share text-based content as well as videos. My students really prefer videos, but I'm somebody that really prefers reading that content. But that allows students to learn the way they want to learn. And then providing some multiple opportunities for demonstrating that learning. So can they do that in multiple ways? Are there options? And we'll deconstruct that or talk a little bit about that a little bit more. That whole course alignment piece is making sure that our assessments, and typically our graded assignments, are aligned with the outcomes and what we want students to learn. I think oftentimes when I talk about faculty, they have these course learning activities such as discussion posts or non-graded assignments or some activity that's happening in class. And that's not necessarily scaffolding how students need to demonstrate their learning in assignments. And so we really have to, if we can align those elements of a course, students are better able to learn, but also better able to demonstrate what they're learning. And it's not really dependent on these logistical elements of the course. And then using transparency in learning and teaching. So Marianne Wilkemis's research to really make sure the course is transparent, the expectations, what does a good paper look like? We'll talk a little bit more about that. But all of those elements can help on the design part of it. And then in terms of outcome development, this can apply to courses or as well as anything outside the classroom, anything that involves learning. Considering different taxonomies, we really focus on Bloom and primarily Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, but there is an affective taxonomy and a psychomotor taxonomy that Bloom helped develop. But there's some other ones that are actually might be a little bit more useful. So Fink's taxonomy is significant learning, which actually is not hierarchical at all, but talks about all the different types of learning that might happen. And one course or one learning activity may include multiple. Or the medicine wheel, which is a non-Western perspective that really highlights the spiritual element of how we learn and that type of learning. So it really moves, in some ways mirrors Bloom a little bit in terms of the structure, but it pulls in some additional dimensions. And really, once I learned about this, really broadened my mind in terms of what could be possible in outcome development. Get some students' feedback on the content and wording. This really is the element around bias-free assessment, so get some feedback from students. We also know that there's geographical differences in terms of language that's used. There's socioeconomic status differences in terms of words that are used. You want to make sure that your students are aware of what those outcomes are and they understand those. And perhaps even invite students to help develop and revise those learning outcomes. Help allow students to be partners in that learning process. Give them some ownership of that. Make it a collaborative process. And then also work with students for mapping this outcome. So maybe you want to work with students to map those outcomes across those elements within a course. Maybe map them to the program outcomes. So help students to see how what they're learning in a specific course map to their major, to their program, perhaps even mapping outside of the educational environment to their job or their career or potential careers. So that will help students see the connection of the learning, but also be able to articulate the impact of their learning. The thing about assessment design, really, again, focusing on this bias-free assessment piece and looking at the wording, looking at the phrasing, looking at the terms that are used, maybe get feedback from students or other folks on your campus to make sure those are not biased. Applying culturally responsive assessment methods that Montenegro and Jankowski talked about, keeping in mind students' cultural background, what do they bring to the learning and how they learn. So some students may thrive in a collaborative learning environment, but some other students may not because that's not part of their culture. Their culture is to be the receiver of knowledge. And while we may agree or disagree with that approach, our students are bringing different perspectives to that classroom or to that learning experience. As again, this can apply to any learning environment. And invite students to suggest assignments. I typically assign papers, but there might be other ways that students can demonstrate their learning. Allow them to offer options and learn from those options. Also discuss assignments in class or in class or via video, not just in writing in the syllabus or not just with the rubric, because doing it in class provides another way of sharing that content and also via video. But if you do it in class, you have the opportunity, provide the opportunity for students to ask questions that they want. As I mentioned, provide options for students to demonstrate their learning. This is challenging, I'll be honest, as I try to think about doing this in my courses. Are the assignments equal rigor? Is a presentation the same rigor as a paper? Is a project more rigorous than a paper? Or is it more rigorous than an infographic? So those are some of the things I think we have to struggle with in our field in higher education, but providing opportunities for students to demonstrate their learning allows them to demonstrate their learning and not allowing the assessment method itself to get in the way of that demonstration. Because we don't want to be assessing the assessment method, we want to be assessing the learning. If you provide closed-ended tests, provide some open-ended answers or responses so students can actually explain their answers. So you get a little bit more understanding of why they chose that. Especially from an improvement standpoint, if you provide those open-ended responses, you might get a sense of why students chose the wrong answer, for example. Consider portfolios, because this really allows students to upload various artifacts to be able to reflect on that learning, which might provide a little bit more understanding of that learning than some other traditional methods such as papers or presentations. Then in regard to grading, consider contract or bundling grading. So allowing students to choose which assignments they want to complete for a grade. So they may complete a specific set of assignments for a B, a specific set for an A. Now, of course, as an instructor, you can decide which ones fit into each bundle, but that provides some opportunity for students. And particularly when we're working with students who are adult learners or have multiple responsibilities, that provides them an opportunity to balance their coursework with a lot of other outside responsibilities. Use mastery grading. So allow students to provide multiple opportunities to retake a test or to pass an exam or to rewrite a paper. Now, of course, this is a little bit more difficult in large classrooms. It's easier in small classrooms, and it might not always be possible. I try to do this, but I can't use this in all of my classes. But that's one more equity-centered approach to grading, which has an impact on assessment. Discuss those grading tools and processes with students. Explain the elements of the rubric and how that's going to assess their learning. Make sure students understand what each dimension is and what's required at each level within that dimension. And sharing examples of good and poor work, particularly for first-gen students who may not have that understanding, that those examples can provide some really good guidance. And those are some of the key suggestions that Marianne Wilkemus discusses in her TILT framework. And then also apply grading for equity practices. So there's some emerging research around here about the impact of averaging grades. You might want to consider weighting grades in the second half of the semester higher because students are now acclimated to that topic. You know, think about those some of those STEM courses that many of us may have struggled in, organic chemistry or calculus for me. You know, it would have been nice to have some of those later assignments graded more heavily when I had some practice. So also consider not grading all assignments. Treating some as practice, allowing for mistakes for students to learn. And one course where we have students write a research proposal, we actually have to do it more in a dissertation proposal format. We have them do it in chunks and we don't grade those chunks. We grade the final product. So that allows students to kind of try some things out. We give them extensive formative feedback and that really helps them learn, but also do a better job learning at the end and then demonstrating that learning in their final product. And then also there's some emerging literature about the impact of participation in grades, because I think some of us have this idea about what is ideal engaged participation, which is typically talking in class. But we all know that people are different. I'm a processor. I'm not readily one to speak up in class where some of my colleagues, they think on their feet, they can speak more readily. There may be some dynamics in the classroom where one student seems to dominate all the time, so other students don't speak up. And so there are a lot of things from an equity perspective that can play into this participation, which could negatively affect grades. There's actually been some interesting articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education recently, last few weeks, talking about some of this. And the final set of suggestions around grading is doing test item analysis. So hopefully you're doing that already to find out if there's some test items that a lot of students are not doing well on. But if you have a large enough group, maybe disaggregate this by student identity. See, are there differences in failure rates or pass rates for different student populations? Provide flexible guidelines because students may be balancing a lot of things, not only outside responsibilities, but health, depression, mental health issues. And there actually have been 2 different articles in the Chronicle of Higher Ed where faculty have talked about providing these flexible deadlines and realizing that it didn't actually impact their work and it provided a lot more flexibility for students. One author actually talked about she got fewer requests for extensions because she had already provided that to them. And she said that the learning didn't change over time. And so that might be worth thinking about. And again, it may not be possible to do this in all classes. There may be a class where deadlines are actually something you want students to learn. And so that may not be appropriate. But there are a lot of different strategies that you can apply. As I mentioned earlier, these low stakes ungraded assignments, the practice concepts. Also thinking about providing these low stakes ungraded assignments as scaffolding to a larger project or chunking out assignments so they do a little bit at a time that moves them towards that final project. I'll pass it over to Anne, talk a little bit about other things that really can transcend just academic settings into more different educational settings.
Yeah, so Gavin's been talking a lot about classroom and student learning assessment, which is a primary thing that many people are thinking about, but there's all kinds of other pieces of assessment that we're engaged in, right? So in terms of just data collection generally, again, thinking about bias-free assessment, ensuring that our demographic items are inclusive. And again, I would mention here, including students in all of that to really cross-check the language and how that resonates. Using multiple methods and including qualitative methods in the use so that we're not always driving towards the quantitative disaggregation of data only as those data points. Ensure people from small populations are included. So we've got this tendency to think about the small n and just sort of disregard and throw that out. But each one of those responses is a human being. And so understanding that in many cases, some populations at your campus, there is a very small n. And so a few responses in those categories are very important. And they're very important to that person all the time. Reviewing your standardized instruments for inclusivity. So really thinking about the way in which those instruments were validated or normed and what they're built on, and really understanding that. And then co-creating assessment measures. So collaboratively with colleagues, also with students, to really have a variety of points of view, and to ensure that it's not just one point of view. When we think about data analysis and interpretation, disaggregate, and really thinking about how you are approaching that disaggregation of that data, and the ways that you are looking at that interpretation. Using multiple data sources, so not just relying again on the statistics that come out of the quant, but looking at multiple ways that we can approach the question and have multiple data sources. And then again, engaging stakeholders in the data interpretation, so that as we mentioned, our own identities are going to get in the way, our biases are going to be there. And so we need to have multiple lenses to make sure that we're really got some valid interpretation. When we think about data reporting and use, we want to ensure that we are avoiding deficit-based reporting. And so there's a lot of scholarship about this, about the ways that we write about, and talk about in our reporting in a way that is deficit focused. And so really making sure that we've got that lens, that equity-minded lens on when we're doing our writing. Avoiding using dominant identities as the norm. So again, the way we do comparisons, even in tables or as we write the reports up, cross-checking to make sure that we're not using dominant identities as the norm. Thinking about using the data to identify barriers for equitable outcomes. So what are the other ways that we can, what else can we see in the data that helps us understand the inequities that may be more systemic, even though maybe our approach for this particular assessment may have been to ask individuals questions about their perspective, but really thinking about equitable outcomes more generally, and also using that data to advocate for structural change. So using the opportunity here to advance assessment for social justice and to decolonize and to be anti-racist by lifting up the data that helps us advance structural change. When we think about program review, we can build in the expectation that the program will explore and address equity issues. So if we use things like the CAS standards, we know that those are built in. But whatever the program review process is that you have, either for academic programs or others, centering equity in that and using an equity-minded approach to all we do, again, as opposed to having just diversity, equity, inclusion as an item among many. Disaggregating success factors like course grades and drop and failure rates and DFWs and graduation rates by student demographics to determine any differences, really digging in to understand those differences and paying attention to the outliers, not just the means or the most frequent result. I think more people are getting used to this idea, but it is a way that most people have been trained is to look at the bell curve and to look at the mean and to ignore the outliers. And really, again, this is similar to the small n problem, which is we need to understand those things as opposed to cast them away from just a statistical point of view. We also can involve students more deeply in the program review process. So throughout, in terms of thinking what the goals of the program review are, the impact on them in the program that they're in, academic program or student affairs or other programs, and also include them in reviewing and interpreting some anonymized data. So getting their view of what is the data saying and how does that sync with their own experience in the program. and also involving students to develop current student or alumni surveys regarding the program. They will have great ideas about the kinds of questions that could and should be asked. And again, that will involve many more stakeholders and center the student voice in that analysis.
So as we come to the end, we're going to add in a shameful plug for our shameless plug for reframing assessment to center equity theories, models, and practices. You know, Ann and I were co-editors and co-authors to some of the chapters, along with all these amazing folks. Really, the focus of the book is to provide a little bit of foundational. Some of that there's more in-depth discussion of the scholarship that I mentioned, but also a lot more of those how-tos with some case study examples of institutions and programs that are doing some of this work right now. So there's some clear expectation or clear examples of what we've kind of described in terms of strategies. Well, thanks for tuning in. Please be sure to check out the resource folder that we've included the link to right here. In that resource folder is it's an overview of the medicine wheel, an article by Lefevre that articulates that. The blog post that Anna and I drafted that provide a background on the framework is in there, as well as a lot of other resources. So we hope you'll check that out. Thanks again. We hope this session was helpful.
Thank you.